Hello, everyone. Dan Miller. I'm back. I shot a 250 a 250 video podcast just a couple of minutes ago. It's posted up. Um, Goodness knows who'll see it or ever see it. But I'm doing another one. I'm doing something different. Something different. Pandemic. 5 years ago. Kind of this week, as far as I'm concerned. As some of you know, I did an extensive series on 100 years ago, tracking the pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918. That's where I kind of got this idea of, X years ago, this week or this day. So 5 years ago, I started that concept, and it's been very beneficial as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully, you've had some measure of agreement with that statement. But I thought, you know what, Dan? Come on, dude. Let's do 5 years ago. What stands out? As some of you know, in my Redux, I've got my podcast here, and I do a top five. So let's do a top five for my reminders of what we learned 5 years ago as we began to look at 1918, the influenza pandemic, as our own pandemic started and unfolded. A few quick thoughts. Number one, do you remember we talked about that the episode, the experience, was going to collide with whatever was important at the time? That's what happened in 1918. I would argue that's what happened in 2020 onward. That the pandemic collided with the predominant reality of the day, be it political or economic or whatever. Now, in 1918, that was military and diplomatic and economic and everything else. It was World War One. I even created my own word, which I kind of really love to do. But warfluenza, it wasn't influenza, it was warfluenza because the pandemic, people experienced the pandemic as a joint experience. Influenza and the war. Even if they weren't fighting in it, the war was affecting their daily lives. So it wasn't influenza, it was warfluenza. And I coined a word for us 5 years ago called War Corona. And I suggested that we didn't have World War One, we had World War Trump. A populism, kind of colliding with various things. So that was one thing I think is worth remembering. Second thing worth remembering is bubbles and waves. Remember we talked about that. There were waves of influenza in 1918. Waves that would rise up, go down, rise back up, go back down, and so on. And it wasn't just one big block of experience and of life. It was waves that came and went. That's the same thing in our coronavirus, our COVID, our war corona. Um, the other thing I said, inside of that, there were bubbles inside the waves. Bubbles meant it was something unique or definitional to a group of people or a particular setting of life that was different from everybody else in the wave. Two quick examples. There were in 2020 and on, in our version of the pandemic, War Corona, we had people who honestly kind of thrived on the isolation, the change of work. They were able to work from home, renew a certain appreciation of home. There were a lot of people who thrived in that environment. There's another bubble, which was the people who didn't thrive, who didn't have that option, who a lot of times lost work or lost a lot of opportunities or lost a lot of relationships because they just weren't able to convert their bubble into something positive. School-aged children are a bubble unto themselves in terms of how it affected them too within the various waves, and we're still seeing that effect. A third thing I would say is that we showed that, number one, it's not just one big blob. We talked about waves, but it also wasn't just one big, star-spangled banner in 1918 to 1921. That's really the span of their pandemic. A lot of divisiveness, a lot of disagreement, a lot of bad feelings and ill will in all of that. Very important thing. If school boards had a vote on things, the votes were 4-3, not 7-0. If public health administrative boards had votes on procedures about influenza, it was 5-4, not 9-0. So there was a lot of divisiveness then that might have been lost in looking back at it in a more nostalgic way. I don't have to tell you what that's like for us in our 2020 experience of it. Another thing I would say is there were there were unique impacts on specific sectors, and this is different than my bubbles thing, right? So, for example, public health emerged basically a sparkling brand new profession, highly respected, highly engaged, and just highly energized as a result of the pandemic of 1918 to 1921. Public health has had a very different experience, I think, in our version. No, my point being, it's like a rhyme, right? Hog and fog. They rhyme, but they're two different things. Um, Public health had its own unique experience, just like public health had a unique experience in 1918, 1921. Medical research had much the same, just so you know, too, in 1918 to 21, in terms of its own unique experience, much that rhymes with medical research in our version of the pandemic. So those are some thoughts. I got to leave you with a few questions to ask. What's your top five? Based on your experience of the pandemic 2020 onward, what would be your top five? And I would challenge you to do one thing as a favor to me. Maybe make sure, if you can answer those five things, maybe make sure that one of them represents something that ended up disagreeing with one of your basic assumptions. I'm guessing that most of us are going to come with five things that tend to confirm our assumptions from then or our assumptions now. Okay, that's fine. But I want you to try to find one that doesn't do that, that ends up being one of your top five, too. A couple things just to throw out to you to bear in mind. As you look back now 5 years ago, when do you think it started? When for you and your family did it start? And then, just as importantly, when did it end? Um, I'm kind of guessing there's going to be a percentage of folks who will say, well, it hasn't ended. That's not for me to decide for you, but I'm just, so when did it start and when did it end? And the other thing, and I'll get out of your way, and hang on, my throat's dry. Um, what's the one lesson? What's the one macro lesson? Now, if it's expressed in a micro form with you, your family, whatever, that's fine. But I want you to think big picture. What's a big picture lesson that you think we ought to take away from my term war corona, our pandemic of 2020 to 2025 or whatever the end date is. So those are your two things. Get your own top five. Get an item in there among those five that kind of disagrees with some of your assumptions. And then secondly, what's one big macro lesson you think we ought to learn? So thank you so much for hanging in with me on this particular kind of special podcast. I'll be back and forth a little bit with some other thoughts about influenza and warfluenza and corona and war corona as we move along. And I'll continue to try to do a better job of posting some hopefully interesting commentary regarding the 1920s as 2020s construct. Oh, whoa, 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 hang on. That's the thing I wanted to tell you too. Sorry. A takeaway from me on our top five of what I discovered is that there is an aftermath. There absolutely is an aftermath that's heavily influenced and defined and soaked in the experience of warfluenza. There is an aftermath. It doesn't just end and it all disappears. It does not do that. It continues throughout the 1920s in some interesting forms. I've got stuff about that on my website. I'll maybe repost that here. But boy, oh boy, that aftermath is a big thing. I suspect you're saying that, yeah, Dan, that's a pretty big thing now too. Hence my construct 1920s as 2020s rhyming. So now I'm ready to let you get back to your day or your night or whatever. So thanks again. I'm Dr. Dan Miller, Historical Solutions LLC, and I'll talk to you soon about this and a variety of other things. Bye bye.